If this kind of story reaches you, if you think there are people in your life who would want to sit with this history, subscribe. This channel exists to make sure these stories are told with the weight they deserve. In the 1920s, before the age of penicillin, syphilis was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Al Capone had contracted it as a young man in Brooklyn, almost certainly before he was 20 years old. The disease, untreated, moves through the body in stages across years and decades. In its final stage, called neurosyphilis, it reaches the brain. It causes dementia, paranoia, personality changes, the erosion, piece by piece, of the person who used to live inside the body. Capone had never been treated. In the world he inhabited, you didn't go to doctors with things like that. You didn't show weakness. You didn't create records. By the time federal prosecutors built their tax evasion case against him in 1931, the case that finally brought him down, the disease was already at work. Some legal historians have speculated that the Capone of the trial was not operating at full capacity, that the man who had outmaneuvered law enforcement for a decade was already quietly losing. On the rock, with no alcohol, no stimulants, no empire to manage, no performance to sustain. There was nothing left to mask what was happening. By 1938, his IQ testing, conducted as part of routine prison assessment, showed results consistent with early dementia. A man who had once orchestrated the logistics of a criminal empire spanning multiple states and hundreds of employees could no longer reliably track a simple work assignment. He was transferred to the prison hospital. He spent his last months at Alcatraz, not in a cell, but in a bed, staring at the ceiling, occasionally speaking to people who weren't there. He was released on November 16, 1939, having served 6 years and 5 months of his 11-year sentence, released early due to the severity of his medical condition. The man who left on the ferry was not the man who had arrived. He went to his estate in Palm Island, Florida. He had a wife, May, who had stayed with him through everything, and a son. He had the ocean outside his window and warm weather and freedom in the technical sense of the word. But the empire was gone. During his years on Alcatraz, the Chicago outfit had not waited for him. Power doesn't wait. Frank Nitti had taken over. The organization had adapted, evolved, moved on. Capone's release generated almost no response from the criminal world that had once orbited around him completely. He tried, in the early years of his release, to reassert some influence. Phone calls were made, meetings were requested. The response, by all accounts, was polite and empty. The mob, like all institutions, respected only present power, and Capone had none. He spent his days fishing, playing cards. Sometimes, when the disease was in a quieter phase, he was lucid and warm and funny, the version of himself that had charmed a city. But those windows shortened over time. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke at his Palm Island estate. He died 4 days later, on January 29th, surrounded by his family. He was 48 years old. The man who had made $60 million a year died with an estate worth, by most estimates, around $32,000. If this story is worth sharing, a like takes 3 seconds and tells the algorithm that history like this deserves an audience. That's all it takes. Here's the part of the Capone story that stays with you. Alcatraz didn't break Al Capone the way its designers imagined. The warden hadn't planned for neurosyphilis. The isolation and the rules and the counted days, those were real and they mattered. But the thing that truly dismantled the most powerful criminal in American history was something he'd been carrying in his own blood for 30 years. Something invisible. Something that waited. Alcatraz removed every distraction, every layer of performance and mythology, and purchased loyalty that had allowed a sick man to function as a king. When you strip all of that away, when the suit is gone, and the guards won't learn your name, and the city 3,000 miles away has already replaced you, what's left is just a man. And in Capone's case, a man who was already disappearing from the inside out. 1,576 men passed through Alcatraz in its 29 years. Most of them walked out and rebuilt, in some form, a life. Capone walked out and found that the life he'd built had already been demolished in his absence. He had 4 years of confused, diminished freedom before his body gave out entirely. The most feared man in America spent his final days catching fish in Florida, waiting for a clarity that never came back. There's something in that story that I keep coming back to, and maybe you do too. We spend so much time fearing the consequences that come from outside, the arrest, the sentence, the fall. But the real reckoning is almost always internal, the thing we carry that we refuse to look at. Capone's disease was literal, biological, but the metaphor holds. What we avoid addressing has a way of surfacing on its own timeline, not ours. And by then, the empire has usually already moved on. Tell me in the comments, does a story like this change how you see Capone? Villain? Victim? Or something more complicated than either? I genuinely want to know what you think. Inside Alcatraz, how the prison broke Al Capone. He arrived at the dock wearing a tailored suit. That detail matters, because Al Capone had spent the better part of a decade making sure that everything around him, every room he entered, every photograph taken, every newspaper story printed, communicated one single thing: power, control, the sense that no force on earth could touch him. And then the ferry docked at Alcatraz on August 22nd, 1934, and a guard handed him a prison uniform. And that was the end of the suit. What happened next wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a fight or a riot or a moment of visible breaking. It was something quieter, and in many ways far more disturbing. It was the slow, methodical dismantling of a man who had built his entire identity around the belief that he was untouchable. The question isn't whether Alcatraz punished Al Capone. The question is, did it destroy him? When Capone stepped off that ferry, he was 35 years old. He had run the Chicago outfit through the bloodiest years of Prohibition. He had ordered the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929. 7 men from the North Side gang lined up against a brick wall on North Clark Street and shot dead. He had bribed judges, owned police officers, and moved so much money through his operation that federal investigators estimated his annual income at $60 million, which in today's terms would be somewhere close to $1 billion. He had already done time at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, a brief stint for carrying a concealed weapon. He'd found it manageable. His cell had rugs, a cabinet radio, expensive furniture. The warden called him Snorky, his nickname. Visitors came and went. Business, to a significant degree, continued. That was the world Al Capone understood, the world where money bent the rules, where a man of his reputation was accorded a certain dignity, even behind bars. He arrived at Alcatraz expecting the same arrangement. He would learn, inside the first 48 hours, that he had made a fundamental miscalculation. Warden James Johnston had been briefed. He'd received a direct communication from J. Edgar Hoover himself expressing interest in how Capone's time on the Rock would unfold. Johnston's response was characteristically brief and total. Capone would be prisoner number 85. He would have the same cell as every other man, the same food, the same rules, and the same complete, absolute isolation from the levers of influence he had spent his entire adult life constructing. The suit was taken. The radio was not permitted. The visitors were restricted to immediate family, 1 hour per month. And the empire, 3,000 miles away in Chicago, began, slowly, to forget that its king was still alive. In the first weeks, Capone tested the system the only way he knew how, quietly, carefully, with the instincts of a man who had always found the seam in any structure, the person whose price had not yet been named. He approached guards, not with explicit offers, he was too smart for that, with conversation, with warmth, with the particular magnetism that had made him in the outside world genuinely beloved by people who should have known better. He'd funded soup kitchens during the Depression. He'd thrown parties that neighborhoods talked about for years. He knew how to make a person feel seen. The guards at Alcatraz had been specifically trained for this. Johnston's instruction was almost philosophical in its simplicity. You do not have a relationship with the inmates. You have a function. You count them. You feed them. You enforce the rules. You do not become a character in their story. Capone was assigned to work detail in the laundry. He worked alongside men who had no interest in who he had been on the outside. Some of them were more dangerous. Some of them were there precisely because they'd operated in the same world as Capone and had old scores that hadn't been settled. In August of 1936, 2 years into a sentence, an inmate named James Lucas attacked Capone in the barber shop with a pair of scissors, stabbing him in the back. Capone survived, but the message was clear and it wasn't lost on him. On the rock, his name bought him nothing. In some rooms, it actively made him a target. He began to withdraw. Records from the prison's psychiatric files, declassified decades later and examined by historian Lawrence Bergreen in his biography of Capone, show that by 1937, guards were noting behavioral changes, mood swings, moments of apparent confusion, difficulty concentrating during work detail. What no one knew yet, what even Capone himself may not have fully understood, was that his mind was already beginning to come apart. Not from the prison, from something he'd been carrying since long before he arrived.